March 14, 1945, near Lake Balaton, Hungary. A bitter wind swept across the frosted fields as Hungarian Lieutenant Colonel Miklos Horváth huddled in his command post, hands wrapped around a tin mug filled with a watery brew that barely deserved the name coffee. The ersatz mixture of roasted barley and chicory provided warmth but little else. Horváth believed the coming days would finally turn the tide against the advancing Americans, their soldiers surely as depleted and demoralized as his own men. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Horváth and his fellow officers would soon discover about American provisions, particularly their seemingly endless supply of real coffee, would shatter their understanding of the war and reveal the true nature of the industrial gulf between the Axis and Allied powers. Captain Ferenc Nagy pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as he entered the command bunker. The underground room, reinforced with timber supports and lined with maps, served as the nerve center for the Hungarian 3rd Infantry Division, now operating alongside German forces in western Hungary. The division had been fighting alongside their German allies for years, though relations had grown increasingly strained as the war turned against the Axis. "Lieutenant Colonel, the reconnaissance patrol has returned," Nagy reported, stamping his feet to bring feeling back to his toes. They encountered an American forward position near Székesfehérvár. 2 prisoners were captured during the engagement. Horváth looked up from the situation map spread across the wooden table. Red pins marked the relentless Soviet advance from the east, while blue pins showed the Americans pushing from the west. The Hungarian forces were caught between hammer and anvil, with supplies dwindling daily. "American prisoners? Good work. What intelligence have they provided?" Horváth asked, his breath visible in the cold air of the bunker. "They're being interrogated now, sir. Initial reports suggest they're from the American 83rd Infantry Division. The patrol also recovered some of their rations and equipment," Nagy replied, producing a small cloth sack. "I thought you might be interested in examining what our enemies are carrying these days." Horváth nodded, his curiosity piqued. Understanding enemy capabilities was crucial, especially as their own supplies had deteriorated to desperate levels. The Hungarian forces had been subsisting on ever-decreasing rations for months. Real coffee had disappeared completely, replaced by various substitutes that grew more unpalatable with each passing week. "Let's see what the Americans are carrying these days," Horváth said, clearing space on the map table. Nagy emptied the contents of the bag. Several small cardboard boxes tumbled out, along with tins of various sizes, a bar of chocolate wrapped in paper, and packets of cigarettes. The officers in the room gathered around, expressions a mixture of professional interest and personal curiosity. "These are their K-rations, sir," Nagy explained, opening one of the boxes. "Each soldier carries these for field operations." Horváth examined the contents with growing amazement. Each box contained a complete meal, canned meat, biscuits, sugar, and most surprisingly, a small packet labeled instant coffee. "What is this instant coffee?" Horváth asked, holding up the small packet. Major István Kovács, the division's logistics officer, took the packet and examined it closely. According to intelligence reports, the Americans have developed a form of coffee that dissolves instantly in water. No brewing required. "Propaganda," scoffed Captain Béla Takács, the communications officer. "Next you'll tell me they have portable kitchens in their backpacks." "Let's find out," Horváth decided. "Kovács, have the orderly bring hot water." When the steaming water arrived, Kovács tore open the packet and poured the brown granules into a clean mug. The aroma that immediately filled the bunker caused a momentary silence among the men. It was the unmistakable smell of real coffee, rich, aromatic, and startlingly potent. "My God," whispered Nagy. "It's genuine coffee." Kovács stirred the hot water into the granules, which dissolved immediately. The scent grew stronger, and several officers unconsciously moved closer. It had been years since most of them had smelled real coffee. Horváth took the mug and inhaled deeply before taking a cautious sip. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "It's strong," he remarked, taking another sip. "Much stronger than anything we've had in years." He passed the mug to Nagy, who eagerly accepted it. As the mug made its rounds, each officer's reaction was similar. Surprise followed by appreciation, then a growing realization. "No wonder their sentries stay alert," Takac said after his turn. "This would keep a man awake for hours." "And they have this every day?" asked Kovac incredulously. "Every common soldier." Nagy nodded, examining another packet from the ration kit. "According to the packaging, this is standard issue. Each man receives multiple rations daily, each containing coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, luxuries our men haven't seen in months, if not years." The implications hung heavy in the air. While Hungarian soldiers subsisted on watery soup and bread that grew more meager by the week, American troops received chocolate, cigarettes, and real coffee as standard rations. It wasn't just the coffee itself that was shocking, it was what it represented. "It's not just about staying awake on watch," Horvath said slowly, articulating the thought forming in all their minds. "This is about industrial capacity. If they can provide such luxuries to every soldier on the front line, what does that tell us about their production capabilities?" The room fell silent as the officers contemplated this question. For years, German and Hungarian propaganda had depicted Americans as soft, decadent, and ultimately unprepared for the hardships of war. Yet here was evidence that American soldiers were better supplied with even non-essential items than Axis troops were with basics. "Let's examine everything," Horvath ordered, breaking the contemplative silence. The officers methodically unpacked the remaining rations. Each item revealed the same story. The chocolate was real cocoa, not the carob substitute their own officers received on special occasions. The cigarettes were made from quality tobacco, not the harsh, adulterated mixture that Hungarian soldiers rolled from whatever they could find. Even the canned meat contained more protein than many Hungarian civilians saw in a week. Major Kovacs, with his logistician's mind, was the first to articulate the full significance. "Sir, consider what this means," he said quietly. "If they can produce coffee and chocolate in such quantities that every frontline soldier receives it daily, what does this tell us about their production of essential war materials? Tanks, aircraft, ammunition?" Horvath nodded grimly. "It tells us everything, Major." The revelation of the coffee became a window into a broader truth that propaganda had obscured. The sheer productive capacity of the United States was beyond anything they had been led to believe. If American factories could churn out luxuries in such abundance, their production of weapons must be equally prodigious. As the officers continued their examination, Sergeant Tamas Varga entered the bunker and saluted. "Sir, the prisoners have been processed. The intelligence officer requests your presence for the interrogation." Horvath nodded, his mind still preoccupied with the coffee revelation. "I'll be there shortly. Captain Nagy, accompany me." The American prisoners were being held in a small outbuilding that had once been a storage shed for a local farm. Inside, 2 American soldiers sat on wooden crates, their hands bound, but otherwise unharmed. Protocol dictated humane treatment of prisoners, and despite diminishing resources, the Hungarian officers maintained this standard. The senior prisoner, a staff sergeant named William Miller from Pennsylvania, looked up as Horvath and Nagy entered. Despite his captivity, he maintained a composed demeanor that impressed the Hungarian officers. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Horvath," he introduced himself in accented but serviceable English. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law." Miller nodded. Staff Sergeant William Miller, 83rd Infantry Division, United States Army. The second prisoner, a younger man with a bandaged arm, added, "Private First Class Robert Jenkins, same division, sir." Horvath studied them. Both appeared healthy, well-fed and properly equipped, despite weeks of frontline combat. Their uniforms, though muddied from combat, were of noticeably better quality than the increasingly threadbare attire of his own men. "You were captured near Székesfehérvár," Horvath stated. "What was your unit doing in that sector?" Miller shrugged. "Can only give you name, rank and serial number, sir. You know the rules." Horvath nodded, respecting the response. He decided on a different approach. "We examined your rations," he said, watching their reactions. "Particularly your coffee." Miller smiled slightly. "Best thing about K rations. Everything else is pretty mediocre, but the coffee's decent." "You consider it merely decent?" Nagy asked, unable to hide his surprise. Jenkins laughed. Compared to real coffee back home, it's barely drinkable, but it does the job when you're on watch at 3 in the morning. Horvath and Nagy exchanged glances. What these Americans considered barely drinkable had been the most authentic coffee they'd tasted in years. "How often do you receive these rations?" Horvath asked. "Every day," Miller replied, seeing no harm in answering. "Sometimes more if we're on extended patrols, though most guys trade for extra cigarettes or chocolate. They trade away coffee?" Nagy asked incredulously. "Some do," Miller shrugged. "Depends on personal preference. Me, I save my coffee. Never know when you'll need to stay alert for 24 hours straight." Horvath nodded thoughtfully. "And your unit, is it well supplied with other materials as well? Ammunition? Fuel?" Miller smiled knowingly but remained silent on operational matters. The younger prisoner, Jenkins, was less disciplined. "We've got plenty of everything, sir. Artillery fires so many shells they don't even count them anymore. Our guys complain when the fresh bread is 3 days old. My buddy's a tank driver, says they get more gasoline than they can use." "Jenkins," Miller said sharply. "What? It's just food and gas. Not like I'm giving positions," Jenkins protested. Horvath found Jenkins' candor revealing not for specific intelligence, but for the casual assumption of abundance it displayed. The American took for granted what Hungarian forces now considered precious luxuries. After concluding the basic interrogation, Horvath returned to the command bunker, his mind troubled by the implications of what he'd seen and heard. The contrast between American plenty and Hungarian scarcity wasn't just a matter of comfort. It revealed the fundamental reality of the war's outcome. That evening, as officers gathered for the daily situation briefing, the atmosphere had changed subtly. The captured American rations had been distributed among the staff for examination, and the psychological impact was evident. Major Kovacs had prepared a more detailed analysis of the American supplies, comparing them with their own dwindling resources. His report made for sobering listening. "Based on our intelligence and today's discoveries, I estimate that the average American infantry division consumes more fuel in a day than our entire regiment receives in a week," he stated flatly. "Their artillery expenditure similarly exceeds our monthly allowance within days, and as for food supplies, the caloric intake of an American soldier is approximately 3 times that of our own men." Captain Takac, who had initially dismissed the instant coffee as propaganda, now appeared deeply troubled. "What about their weapons production? Can we estimate that as well?" Kovacs nodded grimly. "Using consumption ratios as a baseline, and factoring in known shipping capacities, American weapons production likely exceeds the entire Axis output by a factor of at least 4 to 1. And that's a conservative estimate." The room fell silent as the officers absorbed this information. For many, it was the first time they had confronted the war's reality without the filter of propaganda. "The question becomes," Horvath said finally, "what does this mean for our strategic position?" No one immediately answered, the implications too uncomfortable to voice aloud. Colonel Gabor Ferenczi, who had arrived that afternoon from division headquarters, cleared his throat. As the most senior officer present, his perspective carried weight. "Gentlemen, let us speak plainly. The industrial disparity between our forces and the Americans is not a matter of opinion but of fact. We have been fighting with increasingly limited resources against an enemy with seemingly unlimited supply." "But our cause is just," protested Lieutenant Sandor Nemeth, one of the younger officers and a dedicated believer in Axis propaganda. "Our men fight with courage and determination." "Courage is admirable, Lieutenant," Colonel Ferenczi responded, "but it cannot manufacture ammunition or produce fuel. Coffee is merely a symbol of a larger truth." Horvath nodded in agreement. "Colonel Ferenczi is right. We must face reality without illusion if we are to make sound decisions." The next morning, Horvath awoke before dawn, his sleep interrupted by both tactical concerns and the lingering effects of the American coffee he had sampled. He made his way to the observation post overlooking the valley, where American forces were expected to advance in the coming days. Captain Nagy joined him as the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. They stood in silence, watching as darkness gradually gave way to the grey light of morning. "I spoke with the American prisoners again last night," Nagy said finally. "I asked about their home supplies, what civilians receive." "And?" Horvath prompted when Nagy paused. "They said civilians at home have rationing, but it's nothing like what we experience. Their rations include meat several times weekly, real coffee, sugar, gasoline allotments. Their shortages would be considered abundance here." Horvath nodded, unsurprised after what they'd already discovered. "The staff sergeant mentioned something else," Nagy continued. "They have something called the Lend-Lease program, sending supplies not just to their own troops, but to all Allied forces. The British, the Free French, even the Soviets receive American equipment and supplies in quantities we can barely comprehend." This information added another dimension to Horvath's growing understanding. Not only were American forces abundantly supplied, but they were equipping their allies as well, multiplying their industrial advantage across all fronts. The significance of the coffee had expanded from a simple matter of alertness on watch to a window into the fundamental dynamics of the war. It represented not just American abundance, but the complete misrepresentation of the strategic situation that Hungarian and German leadership had perpetuated. Later that day, Horvath called a meeting of his company commanders to discuss the upcoming defensive operations. As the officers gathered in the command bunker, he noticed their gaunt faces and tired eyes, a stark contrast to the relatively well-nourished American prisoners. "Before we discuss tactical matters," Horvath began, "I want to address the discoveries we've made regarding American supply capabilities. It's important that we understand the reality of our situation." He gestured to Major Kovac, who had prepared a more comprehensive briefing on Allied production capabilities based on intelligence reports that had previously been downplayed or dismissed. "American industrial output reached unprecedented levels in 1944, Kovac explained. "They produced over 96,000 aircraft last year alone, more than Germany has manufactured in the entire war. Their tank production exceeds 40,000 units annually. Monthly ammunition production is measured in millions of tons." The company commanders listened with growing disbelief and concern. "This cannot be accurate," Captain Balog objected. "Our intelligence services would have informed us if the disparity was this extreme." "The information was available," Colonel Ferenczi interjected, "but its implications were uncomfortable, so it was minimized or reinterpreted at higher levels." "Consider what we've witnessed personally," Horvath added. "The increasing American air presence, their ability to replace losses, their abundant supplies. The evidence has been before our eyes, gentlemen. The coffee is merely the most recent confirmation." The meeting continued with tactical discussions, but an undercurrent of realization ran through all deliberations. The officers began speaking more honestly about capabilities and limitations, abandoning the optimistic assessments that had previously characterized their planning. As the day progressed, Horvath arranged for the American prisoners to be transferred to the Divisional Prisoner Collection Point, from where they would be sent to a permanent POW camp. Before their departure, he had one final conversation with Staff Sergeant Miller. "Your men will be relocated to a proper prisoner of war facility," Horvath informed him. "In accordance with international conventions." Miller nodded. "Appreciate the professional treatment, Colonel." Horvath hesitated, then asked a question that had been troubling him. "Your coffee, your supplies, do your men understand what they represent?" Miller considered the question carefully. "Most don't think about it much, it's just normal to us. But our officers tell us sometimes that every K ration, every bullet, every gallon of fuel is a reminder that we've got the entire American industry behind us. They call it the arsenal of democracy." "Arsenal of democracy," Horvath repeated thoughtfully. "An apt description." "Can I ask you something, Colonel?" Miller said as he was about to be escorted away. Horvath nodded. "Your men, they fight hard with real determination. But they must know by now which way this war is going. Why continue?" It was a profound question that cut to the heart of Horvath's own internal struggle. Duty, orders, and for many, concern about what lies to the east, Horvath answered honestly. "The Soviets are advancing from the other direction, and many Hungarians fear them more than they fear Americans." Miller nodded in understanding. "The coffee was good then?" he asked with a slight smile. "It was enlightening," Horvath replied. The following days brought increasingly heavy American pressure on their positions, artillery barrages. Once carefully rationed by Hungarian and German forces, came from the American lines in seemingly endless succession. The disparity in firepower became impossible to ignore or explain away. In his command bunker, Horvath gathered with his senior officers to assess their deteriorating situation. Maps showed American forces advancing steadily, their progress seemingly unhindered by the usual constraints of supply and logistics. They're advancing along 3 axes, Major Kovacs reported, indicating positions on the map. Their fuel consumption must be enormous, yet they show no signs of slowing or extending their supply lines. Their air support operates without restriction, added Captain Takacs. Our remaining aircraft can barely take off due to fuel shortages, while American planes fly multiple sorties daily. The room fell silent as a distant rumble of artillery began, growing steadily more intense. It was another American barrage, and from its sound even heavier than previous bombardments. They're not even trying to conserve ammunition, Captain Nagy observed. Each shell fired represents industrial capacity we cannot match. The barrage continued for over an hour, a symphony of destruction that represented thousands of shells and a manufacturing capability that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could now muster. When it finally ceased, Colonel Ferenczi spoke quietly. The coffee was just the beginning of understanding. This, he gestured toward the sound of the now silent guns, this is the full revelation. Lieutenant Nemeth, the young officer who had previously spoken of courage overcoming material disadvantage, appeared shaken. How were we ever expected to win against this? No one answered immediately. It was Colonel Ferenczi who finally responded, his voice carrying the weight of painful realization. Perhaps we were not. Perhaps those who led us into this conflict underestimated American potential or overestimated our own. Either way, the miscalculation has cost millions of lives. Over the next 2 days, American forces continued their advance. Hungarian units fought defensive actions where possible, but fuel shortages increasingly limited their mobility, while ammunition constraints forced them to carefully ration every shot. In contrast, American units moved with seemingly careless abundance. Their vehicles ran continuously, their artillery fired protective barrages for even minor operations, and intercepted radio communications revealed casual attitudes toward resource usage that amazed the listening Hungarian signals officers. They're complaining that coffee deliveries were delayed by 12 hours, Captain Takacs reported incredulously after one intercepted transmission. They consider this a significant supply issue. The psychological effect on Hungarian officers and men was profound. What had begun with the discovery of American instant coffee had expanded into a comprehensive re-evaluation of the entire war. For many, it was the first time they fully comprehended the magnitude of the Allied advantage and the inevitability of Axis defeat. On March 19th, 5 days after the coffee revelation, American forces launched a major offensive operation. The preparatory bombardment lasted 2 hours, expending more artillery shells than the entire Hungarian division had available in its depots. From his observation post, Horvath watched with a mixture of professional appreciation and personal dismay as American armor rolled forward in seemingly endless columns, supported by aircraft that controlled the skies completely. "It's not just about alertness on watch," he murmured to Nagy, who stood beside him. "It's about everything the coffee represents. Abundance, industrial might, the capacity to wage war indefinitely while we scrape the bottom of empty barrels." Nagy nodded. The coffee was merely a symbol, but symbols can reveal deeper truths. That afternoon, as American forces approached their main defensive line, Horvath made a difficult decision. He called his officers together one final time. "Gentlemen, continuing resistance serves no purpose except the further sacrifice of our men for a cause that can no longer be won," he stated without preamble. "I am ordering a withdrawal to positions east of Lake Balaton. Those who wish to surrender to American forces may do so. I believe they will respect the conventions of war." The decision, though painful, was met with understanding rather than resistance. The coffee revelation had grown into a broader awakening that could not be undone. As Hungarian units began their withdrawal that night, Horvath found himself thinking again about the American coffee and what it had revealed. It wasn't just about caffeine keeping sentries alert. It was about industrial capacity, strategic reality, and the painful recognition of warfare's changing nature. Modern war, he now understood, was not decided primarily by courage or tactical brilliance, though these remained important. It was decided in factories and shipyards, oil fields and farmlands, by production quotas and supply chains. The side that could put more shells in more guns, more fuel in more tanks, and yes, more coffee in more soldiers' cups, held an advantage that no amount of bravery could overcome. 3 days later, Horvath's remaining forces reached their new positions east of Lake Balaton. Reports indicated that approximately 30% of his men had chosen to surrender to American forces rather than continue the retreat. He did not blame them. They had made a rational choice based on the realities they now understood. As he established his new command post, a messenger arrived with orders from division headquarters. Horvath opened the sealed envelope and read the contents with a mixture of emotions. The orders instructed him to hold his position at all costs and promised reinforcements and supplies that he knew did not exist. The disconnect between these orders and the reality he had witnessed was so profound that it bordered on absurdity. Horvath folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. Then he took out his field notebook and began writing what would later be recognized as a significant historical document, his analysis of the industrial disparity between Axis and Allied powers and its decisive impact on the war's outcome. He titled it simply, Reflections on Coffee and War Production. In this document, Horvath methodically detailed how the discovery of American instant coffee had led to a comprehensive reassessment of the strategic situation. He included production figures, supply comparisons, and his own observations of the psychological impact of abundance versus scarcity. The instant coffee in American K-rations, he wrote, represents more than a beverage. It symbolizes an industrial capacity so vast that luxury items can be provided to frontline troops as standard issue. When such abundance exists in non-essential items, one must recognize that essential war materials are being produced in quantities that defy comprehension by Axis standards. He continued, no tactical brilliance or personal courage can compensate for the fundamental disparity in production capacity. When one side can expend resources without constraint, while the other must ration every bullet and drop of fuel, the outcome is mathematically predetermined. Horvath concluded his analysis with a somber recognition. Understanding came too late. Had our leadership recognized American productive potential earlier, perhaps the tremendous sacrifices of this war might have been avoided. 2 weeks later, as Soviet forces approached from the east and American forces continued their advance from the west, Horvath made his final decision. Rather than retreat into Austria with German forces or face Soviet capture, he led his remaining men toward American lines. Under a white flag, he approached an American outpost near the Austrian border. The American officers who received him were professional and correct, treating him with the respect due his rank despite his status as a surrendering enemy. During processing, a young American lieutenant offered him a cup of coffee, real American coffee, hot and strong. "So you know," Horvath said as he accepted the cup, "in a way it was your coffee that brought me here." The lieutenant looked confused, and Horvath didn't elaborate. Some understandings were too complex to explain in casual conversation. After the war, Horvath's reflections on coffee and war production found its way to Western historians studying the collapse of Axis forces. It became noted for its clear-eyed assessment of industrial disparity and its insight into how psychological factors influenced strategic thinking. In the decades that followed, military academics would cite the coffee revelation as a textbook example of how seemingly minor details can provide windows into larger strategic realities. It demonstrated how personal experience could cut through layers of propaganda and wishful thinking to reveal uncomfortable but essential truths. For Horvath himself, who survived the war and eventually emigrated to Switzerland, the lesson remained deeply personal. Each morning for the rest of his life, as he prepared his coffee, real coffee, never substitutes, he reflected on how something as simple as a beverage had illuminated the complex industrial foundations of modern warfare. The aroma always brought him back to that command bunker in March 1945, when Hungarian officers tasted American coffee and suddenly understood why GIs never fell asleep on watch, and why the arsenal of democracy could not be defeated by nations unable to provide even basic supplies to their troops. In his later years, Horváth would tell visitors that the war had been decided not on battlefields but on assembly lines, and that American coffee had been his first glimpse of this fundamental truth. It was a lesson in how industrial might translates to military power, how abundance creates confidence, and how material reality ultimately overcomes ideological fervor. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.